Welcome to Pleasurology Island. I'm Free Thought Steve, the lone pleasurologist. Thanks for stopping by. I'm not entirely alone. I have my faithful Belgian companion, Ingrid, who will never appear in these videos because it's not her nature to want to be the center of attention. But without her, I certainly wouldn't be here. I'm going to be talking today about sex-positive pleasurology versus sex-negative Christianity. Now, it seems to me that people who talk about being sex-positive and how to enjoy sex more avoid the topic of Christianity as much as they can. And then people who talk about Christianity, who atheists and non-believers in Christianity, humanists and agnostics, they will talk about why they don't believe in Christianity, but they very seldom relate that to sexuality and sexual pleasure and improving sexual pleasure, enlarging sexual pleasure, which is what sex-positive pleasurology is about. And what I want to do is bring these two together. And a lot of people are uncomfortable talking about Christianity because Christianity still scares them on an unconscious level. They may have left Christianity behind, but they don't want to think about it anymore because they're still a little bit scared that it might be true. And so they're having to repress Christianity, keep it out of their consciousness. And I know that's how I was to some extent before I started doing pleasurology. And ultimately, I realized that in order to have a completely relaxed consciousness, so that we can have relaxed, high arousal sex, which is sex that will expand out to fill our entire consciousness, and then we can have cosmic full consciousness orgasms. In order to do that, it's important not to have any feeling of anxiety about religion or any belief that religion might possibly be true or that Christianity might possibly be true. And that it's not enough to just not talk about Christianity, put it out of our mind, and ignore it. And of course, this is particularly true for me because I had a very strong Christian upbringing. My father was an evangelical preacher, so I was raised in the environment of evangelicalism, which I see today. There are many, many young people who were raised in evangelical families who are now leaving evangelicalism. And that's a very encouraging thing. I'm very happy to see that. And I just want to share my own experience with dealing with Christianity, my own experience in eliminating Christianity as completely as possible from the belief system of my emotional brain. Because our emotional brain believes a lot of things unconsciously that our intellectual brain may have left behind. We may no longer believe in religion, and in Christianity particularly. But our unconscious brain, if we were raised in a Christian environment, we got so much anti-sexual Christian programming that it is hard for us when we become adults sometimes to engage in sexuality without having our sexuality unconsciously influenced by our emotional brain's early Christian programming. And that's what we have to try and undo, and that's not necessarily an easy thing to do. It takes quite a bit of effort, and so I have put a lot of effort into deprogramming my brain from Christianity over the years. And so I'm going to give a series of talks because I think it's very, very important. I think actually for our whole culture, it is very important for us to grow out of Christianity. Christianity has dominated our entire culture for 2,000 years, and now in the last 300 years particularly, the more progressive, advanced, intellectual, intelligent people have been doing our best to liberate ourselves from Christianity, to liberate humanity from Christianity, but we still have a long ways to go. Christianity isn't going to give up without a fight, because people who believe in Christianity are very emotionally attached to it. It's how they feel safe. They can only feel safe believing in Christianity. And so if you try and reason with them about Christianity, your reasoning with them is not going to get anywhere, because they are already emotionally dug in and committed to believing in Christianity. So you're not going to change their minds. The only people whose minds you are going to change are people who really just don't know what to think, and they need some guidance, clear thinking about religion, the whole issue of God, etc. They need some realistic thinking to balance all of the propaganda that they have gotten their entire lives from the Christian side. The Christians believe in their delusional worldview. It's a delusional worldview because it's believing that the imaginary is real. But they're very committed to believing that the imaginary is real. And they've had 2,000 years of practicing getting propaganda arguments for convincing other people to share their delusion that the imaginary is real. And on the other hand, those of us who are realists are still formulating our arguments against Christianity. And we haven't had as much time, and we haven't been allowed. There were laws against blasphemy. Blasphemy would be, even saying that you think that Christianity isn't true. There have been laws against that that made it a capital crime to commit blasphemy, and they would kill people for daring to suggest that Christianity was not true. So Christianity is a very coercive worldview, and it is based on a series of imaginary ideas, imaginary beliefs, that if you believe them, you are trapped into serving that worldview. It coerces you into serving that worldview, because you're afraid if you don't do that God will be angry at you and that you'll be going to hell forever. And that's the fear, that's the totally imaginary fear that Christianity uses to keep people submitting to that delusional worldview. And you have to believe that. If you grow up in a Christian family, you have to believe that the only way to not spend eternity in hell is to believe that Jesus is your Savior and that Jesus is God's Son. Now, this is a whole bunch of mythology based on, as I said, imaginings. None of the statements of Christianity can be proven to be true. None of them can be verified, because they are all statements about unobservable people and events, unobservable imaginary people. Jesus is an imaginary person. God is an imaginary person. You say, no, Jesus lived. Jesus, the mythical entity of Christianity, is quite different from Yeshua the Galilean, the historical person who went up to Jerusalem believing that Yahweh was going to send an army of angels down to the earth and get rid of all the Romans and liberate Judea from Roman rule, and that possibly then he, Yeshua, was going to be the king of that new kingdom of Yahweh on earth. He was an apocalyptic prophet, meaning he was an end times prophet. He believed that history was about to come to an end, and that God was going to send an army of angels from the sky and get rid of the Romans, And that's why he went up to Jerusalem, to tell everybody about that and to be there when it happened. And it turned out he was totally wrong, because the whole apocalyptic worldview of ancient Judaism was, again, a completely imaginary worldview. The Romans were real. The Roman armies were real. And they crucified Jesus. And, his followers then, finding an empty tomb 2 days later, thought that he had risen from the dead, perhaps. Actually, first they thought the right thing. They thought, well, somebody's come and stolen the body. And that's exactly what did happen. The people that Jesus had made really angry were the Jewish priests who ran the temple in Jerusalem. He came up there and he told them, basically, your temple is profane. God's going to destroy your temple, level it to the ground, and build a new one in 3 days. And he was turning the people against the hierarchy of priests who ran the temple. And in those days, the priests who ran the temple were cooperating with the Romans to rule Judea. So they were the establishment. The temple was big business, and the high priest was the CEO of the temple. And Jesus came up and said, this temple is invalid, illegitimate, and it's going to be destroyed. And so they didn't want a troublemaker like that around, so they arrested him in the middle of the night, and they had Pilate crucify him, which he was glad to do. The Roman governor was always happy to crucify anybody who stood up against Roman law and order. That was a crime. It was called stasis, standing up against Roman law and order. So he crucified him. But then toward the end of the day, a wealthy Jew came to Pilate and gave him a bribe and said, listen, let me have the body of Jesus. You don't need him. He's crucified. He's dead. Let me have the body. So he gave Pilate a bribe. Pilate said, okay, great. Because that was one of the perks of being a Roman governor of a province, was you took all the bribes you could possibly get to line your coffers. And so he said, okay, you can have the body. So Joseph of Arimathea took the body down, put it in a nearby grave, because it was almost sunset. And Sabbath would begin at sunset. And as soon as Sabbath began, you couldn't do anything like move a body and put it somewhere. So he had to get that body quickly into a tomb. And he wasn't going to touch it himself. Joseph had a couple of servants who were probably not even Jewish. And so he had them take the body down and put it in the tomb, because that way Joseph himself would not be polluted by having touched a body. And then he wouldn't be able to celebrate the Sabbath day the next day, which was Passover Sabbath. It was an important day. Well, he couldn't have even eaten the Passover supper that night. So anyway, they put the body of Yeshua the Galilean in the tomb, and closed the tomb up with a stone, and then left. And the body was there from sundown Friday night all day Saturday, because on Friday night, nobody in town could walk more than 100 yards. That was the rule on Sabbath. You couldn't walk more than 100 yards, and you couldn't do any kind of work. And you certainly couldn't touch a dead body. And that was the case all day Saturday. So the body stayed in the tomb all day Saturday until sunset on Saturday night. That marked the end of Sabbath. And at that point, people could start to do stuff. And the people who wanted to do stuff were the enemies that Jesus had made, the people who ruled the temple, and the ones who he'd been debating with perhaps during the day and supposedly had made a fool of them. And anyway, they hated his guts, and they were angry that Pilate had sold Jesus' body to Joseph of Arimathea, because Joseph was going to take that body and possibly turn it into a shrine. He might have taken the body and put it somewhere in a grave that would become the shrine of the martyred Yeshua the Galilean, and all of his followers could come there and plot revolution against the Romans, and having that tomb that shrine of the dead Yeshua, the Galilean prophet, that shrine would be a focus point for future rebellion against the Jews who were running the temple, as well as against the Romans. So the Jews, they were outraged, because what was supposed to happen with the crucified body was that it was supposed to stay there on the cross until it fell to pieces, and there were nothing but bones left there. And then those bones were supposed to be destroyed. There was supposed to be nothing left of that body. That was part of the punishment of crucifixion, was that the body itself would be destroyed. And what that meant was that you couldn't be resurrected in the end. You couldn't be resurrected at the last times. But the Jews believed, those Jews who believed in resurrection, were very careful to preserve the bones of their dead ancestors in a stone box called an ossuary, from osseous meaning bone, and so a bone box basically, and that's what happened. You would put the body in a tomb until all the flesh had rotted away. Then you'd clean the bones and you'd put them in the bone box, and the bone box would be in the tomb, and that would be part of the family tomb. And then on the last day, if you remember that old song, dem bones, dem dry bones, the thigh bone connected to the hip bone, etc. That song is about a passage in the book of Elijah, I think it is, or no, the book of Ezekiel. The book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel sees a valley full of dead bones of Israelites who had died on the battlefield. And he sees them all miraculously brought back to life and given life again. And that's sort of the origin of the idea of the resurrection. So you had to have bones to be put back together and put flesh, and God would put flesh on the bones and then breathe life into the bones, and the person would be resurrected again. But you couldn't do that if you didn't have the bones. And so the Jews of the temple, the Jews in charge of the temple, wanted to make sure that the followers of Yeshua the Galilean did not have the pleasure of putting Yeshua's bones in an ossuary and keeping it in a shrine and preserving it there for the resurrection. They wanted to make sure that Yeshua's body was completely destroyed. So after sunset on Saturday night, when the Sabbath was over and everybody was free to move around town, the priests had their own little exit through the walls to get out of the town to the cemetery outside, just outside the town. And so the priests also had slaves, servants, just like Joseph of Arimathea had. The priests had their servants who were Syrians or Egyptians or somebody, but not Jews. And so the priests took some of their servants out to the tomb where Joseph had left Jesus' body, Yeshua's body, and they opened up the tomb. They took out the body, put it in a sack, put it across a donkey, and took it out and disposed of it. They may have taken it down to the town dump. It was Passover, and people had been sacrificing animals day and night for the past week, and so there was lots of animal remains that needed to be taken down to the city dump at the bottom of Jerusalem called Gehenna, which is where we get the idea of Gehenna being hell, that it was the city dump where they were always burning stuff up. So Jesus' body probably got carried down in a burlap sack on the back of a donkey. The servants took it down. Once the priests would have supervised the servants getting him out of the tomb, unwrapping the body so they made sure they had the right body. That's why there were, wrappings still left on the floor of the tomb. They had the right body, put it in a sack, put it on a donkey, took it down to the city dump, the Gehenna, tossed it into the fire on the heap there of burning animal remains, and Jesus' body was burned up there. And Jesus did not appear to anybody until after the disciples got back to the Sea of Galilee where they lived. They left immediately because they were afraid of getting arrested as Jesus had been. So they left the next day. As soon as the Sabbath was over, they were out of there. They went back to to the Sea of Galilee, and then Peter began to have dreams in which Jesus appeared to him. Peter dreamed he was down by the Sea of Galilee, and here was Jesus walking along the Sea of Galilee and talking to him. And it was a very lifelike dream. And people in those days believed that dreams were magic, and this was a real vision of Jesus saying, I'm not dead, I'm alive. And so that's how Peter started. He told other people, and then other people also had dreams about them. Because having a dream about somebody who has just died is a very common phenomenon, and it feels like it's really, really happening. And, the person's really there. I had a dream like that about my father a week or so after he died. And I heard his voice talking to me, and it was like, just like he was really there. And he said, Stephen, when we die, we are alive. Philippians 1:13. And then I heard this big boom, like thunder or something, and it woke me right up. It turned out the boom that woke me up was the boiler, the huge steam boiler, that I was the night boiler operator at this plant nursery that I worked at for 20 years. And I was sleeping in the room next to it, and when the boiler shut off, it made this big boom that kind of rattled the windows. And that was the boom that I heard. But anyway, there happened to be a Bible there that one of the other night watchmen had. And I looked it up, quickly looked up Philippians 1:13, and it said nothing about when we die, we are alive. Well, I thought, well, maybe he meant Philippians 3:13. So I looked at that, nothing about that. Well, I thought maybe it was Ephesians. I looked at Ephesians 1:13, Ephesians 3:13, none of them, And I could just imagine my father's frustration. He always prided himself on being able to remember the right verse at the right time, and how frustrated he would have been if he had this one chance to communicate with me and gotten the wrong verse. Oh, what a shame. But anyway, that kind of phenomenon is something that our own unconscious, which gives us our dreams, it's our own unconscious which creates this kind of an experience. But if I had been living, 2,000 years ago in Galilee, and I'd had a dream like that and heard my father's voice so distinctly like that, I would have believed that I was really getting a message, from my dead father. So Peter had that kind of experience with his dreams. And from there, because people wanted to believe that Jesus wasn't really dead and he was alive again, then from that on, a few other people had dreams like that. And gradually the idea spread that Jesus had not died, but he had been resurrected. Anyway, that's a bunch of nonsense. But it got a religion started that became a salvation cult in the Roman Empire. And there were lots of salvation cults at that time. One of the most important ones was the cult of Dionysius. That was also, if you became initiated in the cult of Dionysius, when you died, you would go to the Elysian fields, you would go to paradise, instead of being stuck in the Greek hell. The Greeks were really the ones who invented hell. The Jews didn't have hell, they had Sheol, which was just a dark place. But the Greeks had hell. And the Greek hell wasn't a place of fire, it was a place of mud. Dead people spent eternity up to their necks in a pool of mud, and while frogs and snakes jumped and slithered all over their heads and faces. And that was the Greek idea of what hell was like. And so you can see that for us to think about spending eternity up to our neck in a pool of mud with frogs and snakes all around us is just a laughable idea. But because we've been taught, because our culture has taught us to believe in hell, a fiery hell, and a hell of torment, then that's that makes sense to us. That doesn't seem crazy to us. That when our brain shuts down and our consciousness no longer exists, that somehow we're still going to be able to have, that our consciousness is going to be able to float free from our body, even after there's no more brain to produce consciousness, and that consciousness can persist forever, and that somehow it can be in a fiery place where it would feel pain, or in a blessed place where it would feel pleasure, or that it would be given perhaps a new magical body. All kinds of imaginary speculations about the unknowable. That's what religion is based on, imaginary speculations about the unknowable. But the thing that makes it easy for us to believe in a fiery hell, but laughable for us to believe in a muddy hell, is simply what everybody around us believes. Unfortunately, the human emotional brain has evolved in such a way that we tend to believe, our emotional brains will believe what everybody around us believes. This is belief by consensus. If everybody else believes it, it's very hard for me not to believe it. If everybody else believes that the world is flat, it's very hard for me to believe that it's round. If everybody else believes that the sun and the moon go around the earth, then it's very hard for me to believe that the earth is going around the sun and that the moon is going around the earth. It all depends on what other people have told us that they believe. And unfortunately, that's sort of the primitive way that human beings all over the world form their view of the world. We form our worldview on the basis of what other people tell us about the world. And what other people tell us about the world is a mixture of fact and fantasy. Some of what they tell us about the world is based on fact. It's based on reality. It's based on observing reality. And, and then they warn us, if you see a tiger, if you see a leopard, don't go near it. It could attack you, so stay away from it. That's good, realistic advice. But the other type of advice, or the other type of beliefs that we are given by people around us, are based on fantasy. They're based on imagination. We can know absolutely nothing unless we're able to observe what it is that we think we know something about. Knowledge is based on observing reality. A true statement is a statement that corresponds with the way things really are. And the only way that we can know how things really are is by observing reality. But if you imagine non-physical things of any sort, but particularly non-physical agents, non-physical consciousnesses with intelligence, with will, the desire to do this and not do that, and with the ability to do this or not do that, and with magic powers to make things happen, but they're non-physical, and you can never actually observe these entities, then a statement of that sort always remains in the realm of fantasy rather than fact. All of those statements are nothing but imaginings, speculations, guesses about the unobservable, the unknowable. And therefore, anyone who claims to know the truth about something non-physical, not observable, is making a false truth claim. They claim that God exists. That's a false truth claim because we cannot prove that God exists or doesn't exist. They claim that God loves us. Oh, well, if God exists, I hope he does love us. But there's no way that you could claim that that's a true statement. That's a wishful guess. And religion is made up partly of wishful guesses, things that we hope are true, and then partly of terrifying guesses, things that we are afraid are true. And because people don't realize that the original intellectual sin is to confuse the imaginary with the real, and to believe that a statement about the imaginary is actually true, because people don't realize that that is the original intellectual sin, people will accept this mixture of wishful guesses and frightened guesses about the unknowable. Whereas, in fact, we know absolutely zero about the unknowable, about the non-physical, because it's completely unobservable. We cannot observe it with our own senses, and we cannot observe it with any scientific instruments. Scientific instruments can only detect things that actually exist because they are physical in some way. And so, a realist's rule, the first ethical rule of realistic thinking is never confuse the imaginary with the real. Refuse to believe that the imaginary is true. Only believe as true that which we can really observe and prove is true. And we know is true, and we can all agree on that, because it's not hidden from us. It's there. It's right there. And we can observe it with our scientific instruments. We can observe it with our senses. We can see it, touch it, feel it, etc. That is what is real. As soon as you begin making imaginary guesses about the unknowable, and then claiming that they are real, making a false truth claim, and if you can get people to believe it, and if you can get a group of people to believe it, then you're trapped. You're trapped. We have to absolutely refuse to believe that the imaginary is true. I mean, that's where we just have to start from and finish from, is refusing to believe that the imaginary is true. Because otherwise, people can imagine anything at all that they want, and people around the world, everywhere, have constructed elaborate, imaginary worldviews, imaginary guesses about the unknowable. And everybody in a given culture believes the same imaginary fantasy world, imaginary fairy tale ideas, because everybody else in that culture believes it too. This is belief by consensus, belief by agreement. I'll believe it if you believe it. If we all believe it, well, it must be true. No. Imagination never becomes true, no matter how many people believe it. Something that we can imagine would become true only if we can then observe it. If we can go there, look at it, touch it, or use a scientific instrument to detect it. But when you're talking about non-physical things like spirit beings are by definition, they're made up of spirit. What is spirit? Spirit comes from the word breath, pneuma in Greek, breath. Beings made up of breath, because you can't see breath. You never know where it is. As soon as you make up elaborate stories about spirit beings, and you get everybody else to believe them in a whole group, then everybody is scared not to believe the same thing that everybody else believes. But all these different groups around the world all have different sets of spirit beings that they have made up in their imagination. And the problem is, when you start believing that the imaginary is real, then you are deluded. That's a definition of delusion. When you have imaginings that you believe are really true, And the problem is when you believe that something's really true, then you act on it. And that's why it is completely immoral and unethical to believe that something imaginary is true. Because if you really believe that it's true, you're going to act on it. And what you do may be a really terrible thing, not a good thing at all. Religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and Hinduism will fight each other. Any delusional worldview, the people who believe their delusional worldview, if they believe that their imaginary life after death, their salvation after death, depends on doing everything that their delusional worldview tells them to do, their delusional worldview may tell them it's a good thing to kill those people over there because they believe in a different delusional worldview. And if their delusional worldview is true, then our delusional worldview is false. And that means that we're not going to be saved, and we can't allow that. They are going to take us and lead us into perdition if we let them foist off their delusional worldview on us. We have to impose our delusional worldview on them. And unfortunately, you can't decide whose delusional worldview is right or wrong, because you can never prove anything about imaginary ideas. We know absolutely zero about anything non-physical. And so if you can't prove that you're right and they're wrong, you have to fight them and see if you can kill them. And they will try and fight you and kill you back, because killing the other person is the only way to prove that our delusional worldview is right and their delusional worldview is wrong. Now, we don't have to do that with the law of gravity. We've never had any wars about the law of gravity. Some people who believe that the law of gravity is true, and some people who believe that it isn't true, and they have to go to war to find out who's right about it. You don't have to. You can test out the law of gravity very easily. The people who believe in the law of gravity can say, well, you folks, if you don't want to believe in the law of gravity, you have my permission to jump off a cliff and find out whether the law of gravity works or not. Go right ahead. Test out your worldview. And all the people who don't believe in the law of gravity will go jump off a cliff, and then you won't have those people around anymore. And you won't have that delusional worldview around. You'll only have the people who believe in the law of gravity. But you can't do that when you're talking about imaginary things like God and Jesus or Muhammad being the prophet of God. Anything that involves imaginary agents, this is a fantasy idea, a speculation about the unknowable. And humanity has been enslaved by these delusional worldviews for thousands and thousands of years, for 100,000 years. You know, all human cultures have believed in one form or another of delusional worldviews. And 100,000 years is long enough. It's too long. It's time to stop believing in delusional worldviews. And one way to stop believing in a worldview like Christianity is to examine it right from the start, from its earliest formulation back in Judaism, the earliest ideas of Judaism, and see how Judaism evolved into classical Judaism. Early Judaism evolved into classical Judaism, which evolved into apocalyptic Judaism, which evolved into early Christianity, which then evolved into full-blown Christianity. And I've spent a long time. I started seriously investigating this back in the 1980s. I already had a certain background from college on it. And so I'm going to detail that progression of delusional ideas, because once you understand how they all have grown out of each other, and you realize that Yeshua, the historical Yeshua, was a completely unrealistic apocalyptic prophet who really believed that God was going to send the angels down. That thing that he said supposedly on the cross just before he died, the last thing, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, meaning God, God, where are the angels? It's translated as, why have you forsaken me? But what he was actually asking was, where is the army of angels? Where are the army of angels that you promised? Because Jesus had been reading all of these prophecies from the Old Testament and from the apocalyptic prophets who had written after the Old Testament. He had read all these writings, and John the Baptist was the one who had said, the time is at hand. The kingdom is coming. God is going to send the angels down and get rid of the Romans and set up this kingdom. And that's what Jesus believed. That's what Yeshua the Galilean believed. And then Christianity turned Yeshua into the mythological Jesus. Jesus is the Greek way of saying Yeshua. Yeshua means Yahweh is salvation. Yahweh being the God of the Jews and the Israelites. But Yeshua transliterated into Greek is Jesus, and Christos means the anointed one, the one who has had oil poured on his head, anointing him as the future ruler of this kingdom coming from out of the sky. And in every single one of the Gospels, at least the three synoptic Gospels, Jesus is quoted as saying, this is going to happen before everybody here dies. This is going to happen within the lifetime of everybody here. Now, I don't think Jesus said that. I think Jesus believed that it was going to happen when he went up to Jerusalem for Passover. And that's why he was so surprised to find himself hanging on a cross instead. He may have thought that he was going to be arrested and have to suffer, but he thought God was going to come and rescue him at the last minute. And so he came to the realization, ultimately, that that wasn't going to happen. And it broke his heart, and he died right there. But his followers wanted to keep that belief alive. And they said, no, it's going to happen. It's going to happen before the people who were actually alive and listening to Jesus are all dead. Some of them will still be alive, and that kingdom will be coming. And if you read the epistles of Paul, he obviously believed that this was going to happen in his lifetime. He was absolutely sure that he was not going to die. And he said, yes, there are some of the Christians who have died, and they've died before the kingdom came. But don't worry about it, because when God sends the angels and establishes the kingdom, they're going to be raised up out of the grave, and they're going to be given a new magic body, the imperishable body, and they will be part of this kingdom that's going to come, and it's going to be a perfect kingdom, and blah, 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 blah. And so Paul thought that was going to happen right then in his lifetime too. So that was the worldview of the early Christians. Well, here we are 2,000 years later, and they're still saying the same thing. Oh, it's going to happen any day now, any time. You can see it. The signs are all there. Well, that just shows you how tenacious an imaginary delusional worldview is once it gets into the human brain. And that's why it is so dangerous. Delusions are dangerous because people will kill for delusions, people will die for delusions. And because if they have the delusional belief that their afterlife is going to go on for eternity, and it's either going to be happy or unhappy, depending on how closely they have adhered to their delusional worldview. If you get that whole set of delusional ideas programmed into your head and into your emotional brain, then it's very hard not to be controlled by that worldview. And if part of the delusional worldview is that you must teach the delusional worldview to your children, if you want to have the delusional afterlife, good afterlife, then you have to teach the delusion to your children. Children are completely defenseless intellectually. Children know nothing about the world. They believe whatever the adults tell them. And so the adults commit what I believe is an intellectual crime, an ethically immoral intellectual crime of force-feeding a delusional worldview to their children and telling the children they must believe this or they're going to suffer when they die forever. They'll go to hell. This is criminal to me. It is absolutely a criminal act to force-feed innocent, vulnerable, defenseless children with a delusional worldview that's going to go in there and grab hold of their emotional brain and give them a false promise on the one hand and a false threat on the other hand. And between the two, the false promise seduces them into submitting to the delusional worldview, and the false threat scares them, terrifies them into submitting to the delusional worldview, and they're terrified not to do that. And it's very hard for people to break free from that if we don't get strong counter-education. And of course, the delusionists won't allow realistic education in the schools, realistic non-delusional education in the schools, where the children are taught, no, you should never believe as true anything that is purely imaginary about non-physical entities that you can't see or touch. Don't ever believe that the imaginary is true. Refuse to believe that the imaginary is true. That's the only way you can preserve your independence, your intellectual independence, and your emotional independence. Otherwise, if you swallow that delusion, if you let that delusion get into your brain and get hold of your emotional brain, you'll be enslaved to that delusional worldview by your own emotions for the rest of your life. Unless you wake up, smell the coffee, and say, what we know about the unknowable is absolutely zero. And so what I believe to be true about the unknowable is absolutely zero. And anyone who makes a statement about the unknowable and claims to know that it's true is making a false truth claim. And a false truth claim is an ethical crime. And it's a doubly ethical crime to teach false truth claims to young people, children who are too young to be able to make up their own minds about it. So that's just an introduction, and I will be continuing to talk about why sex-positive pleasurologists need to free ourselves completely from Christianity and have no doubt in our mind whatsoever that it is a delusional worldview that the human race needs to leave behind, along with all other delusional worldviews. Okay, thanks for listening. Talk to you again next time.